Most people were taught that the Boer War was simply a colonial skirmish in the dust of South Africa. Classic from a predictable conflict between the roaring British Empire and two small republics of fiercely independent Dutch farmers. History books usually begin the narrative here, with tales of territorial sovereignty and the rights of British settlers, known as the Wheatlanders. Decades, the mainstream version of events presented this as a war of national pride, clash of cultures on the dark continent. But if you close the textbooks and open the private correspondence of London's merchant banks, the emotional rhetoric of imperial glory begins to dissolve. You see, a nation does not deploy nearly 500,000 troops, the largest expeditionary force London had ever sent abroad since the downfall of Napoleon, just to settle a minor dispute over voting rights for gold miners. The real battlefield was not defined by the borders of the Transvaal or the Orange Free State. It was calculated item by item inside the vaults of the Bank of England. Understand why tens of thousands of civilians would eventually perish in the world's first modern concentration camps. Almost look past the gunfire at a far more terrifying force. Old, unyielding mechanics of the global gold standard. By the late 19th century, Great Britain was the undisputed financial capital of the world. British pound, sterling was not just a currency, it was the global anchor of trade. Every transaction, of Shanghai to the cotton fields of America, relied on the absolute stability of the pound. But that stability was an illusion built on a dangerous paradox. Under the rules of the gold standard, every single paper note issued by the Bank of England had to be legally backed by physical gold bullion resting in its vaults. If the gold reserves drained out, an empire would collapse. And by 1890, the financial foundations of London were facing an existential threat. The rapid industrial rise of Imperial Germany and the United States was sucking liquidity out of the British market. From London was running out of gold. And exactly at this moment of financial panic, a discovery was made, deep in the South African ridge, known as Witwatersrand. The largest, most concentrated deposit of gold on the planet, was found resting directly under the feet of those simple Boer farmers. Transvaal Republic, overnight, became the ultimate prize on the geopolitical chessboard. However, control those mines, would control the liquidity of the coming century. For the banking syndicates of the City of London, the existence of an independent Boer government was no longer a diplomatic inconvenience. It was an unacceptable threat of the survival of the British Empire's financial monopoly. Ledger books needed that gold. And when a financial system faces starvation, borders are redrawn, laws are rewritten, and armies are mobilized. Collect the debt. Let us examine the missing chapter of the War for the Witwatersrand. Poverty from, in 1895, a wealthy imperialist named Cecil Rhodes, the king of the De Beers diamond monopoly, initiated a secret plot. Along with his financial partner, Alfred Bate, and with the quiet backing of powerful private banking houses in London, including the House of Rothschild, that has financed a private military invasion into the Transvaal, known as the Jameson Raid. From the surface objective, was to trigger an artificial uprising among the British miners, finding a pretext for the British military to intervene. But it failed catastrophically, ending in the capture of the conspirators. But on the desks of the Colonial Office in London, presided over by Joseph Chamberlain, failure was treated merely as a tactical delay. Correspondence between Rhodes and Chamberlain, which remained hidden in confidential files for years, reveals a chilling consensus. The Boer republics could not be allowed to nationalize, divert their gold production to rival powers like Germany. The flow of gold had to be directed exclusively into the London pipeline, place set by the London bullion market. President Paul Kruger of the Transvaal knew exactly what was coming. He watched as British troop ships began anchoring in Cape Town, not carrying diplomats, but heavy artillery. Kruger made desperate concessions, offering to grant the British miners their political rights. But the British government kept moving the goalposts, as the objective was never political equality. As the objective was total, unconditional control of the mining infrastructure. The banking cartel needed a war to justify the forced liquidation of Boer sovereignty. By October 1899, pressure reached its breaking point. Left with no choice, and knowing that every day of delay allowed more British troops to encircle their borders, republics struck first. The public in London cheered, consumed by wave after wave of jingoistic propaganda. They believed their boys were marching out to defend the honor of the crown, utter against backward, progressive farmers. But in the shadows of the city of London, my mood was far more calculating. The financial machine was finally in motion. The war bonds were issued, the short-term credit lines were opened, the global financial elite prepared to cash in on the slaughter. As the first artillery shells fell in the town of Ladysmith, cost prices of South African mining conglomerates headed on the London Stock Exchange began to fluctuate wildly. Speculators who had been briefed by the inner circles of the syndicate made fortunes overnight, buying up depressed shares. The war was being paid for by the British taxpayer, but the profits were already being funneled into private ledger books. This was not an ordinary colonial expansion. This was a corporate hostile takeover executed by the world's most powerful military. And as the conflict dragged on, far longer than the generals in London ever anticipated. The cost of maintaining global liquidity would be written in blood. Understand why a country's internal voting laws trigger a global military invasion? We must look at the secret heart of the 19th century global economy. In the late 1890s, the British Empire was not just a military superpower. It empire. In the center of that empire was a small geographic square in London, known as the City. Every major railroad in America, coffee plantation in Brazil, and every textile mill in India, funded by capital flowing out of London. The entire world accepted a single, unwritten rule. The British pound sterling was as good as gold. But by 1896, from that fundamental rule, was starting to fracture. The global financial system was operating under a strict, unforgiving mechanism of the gold standard. For every paper pound circulating in the global market, the Bank of England was legally required to hold a fixed amount of physical gold bullion in its subterranean vaults. If international investors lost confidence and demanded physical gold in exchange for their paper notes, the reserves would empty, the credit market would freeze, and the British Empire would face sudden total bankruptcy. And behind the curtain of imperial pride, the Bank of England was running out of time. The industrial landscape of the world had shifted dramatically. The United States, powered by the massive manufacturing boom of the Gilded Age, was flooding the world with cheap goods. Imperial Germany, under the aggressive economic expansion of Kaiser Wilhelm, was rapidly capturing British trade routes in Europe. Both nations were exporting more than they imported, which meant one terrifying thing for London. Gold was steadily draining out of the British financial system. Every week, cargo ships left Liverpool, carrying heavy wooden crates of gold bullion destined for the banks of New York and Berlin. The liquidity of the City of London tying up. The Bank of England's reserve ratio, a practical measure of its survival, was dropping toward the danger zone. London could not find a massive, permanent, and cheap supply of new gold. Dominance of the pound sterling would end, and with it, the global supremacy of Great Britain. And then, the telegrams arrived from South Africa. The discovery of the Witwatersrand Gold Reef, in 1886, had completely altered the geopolitical math. This was not a temporary gold rush, California or Australia. This was an industrial ocean of gold, stretching deep into the earth. By 1898, the mines of the Transvaal Republic were producing nearly 25% of the entire world's annual gold supply. However, there was a fatal complication for the bankers in London. The Witwatersrand Reef did not belong to the British Empire. sat directly beneath the soil of the South African Republic, an independent nation governed by President Paul Kruger and his conservative Boer administration. To the financial cartels in London, the situation was a psychological torment. The survival of the global credit empire depended on a resource controlled by a community of old world Dutch farmers, men who deeply distrusted British imperialism and had zero interest in the survival of the London stock market. Thus, President Kruger was beginning to use this immense financial leverage against Great Britain. The Boer government refused to allow British mining monopolies to consolidate total control over the deep-level mines. Imposed heavy tariffs on dynamite and machinery imported by British corporations. And they began routing their gold exports away from London, sending the raw bullion directly to banks in Paris, Amsterdam, and most dangerously, the German Kaiser had even sent a personal congratulatory cable to Kruger, hinting at military support against British encroachment. Governor of the Bank of England and the merchant banking houses of London, this was an existential emergency. Lifeblood of global finance was being used to fund a rival axis of power. Germany secured exclusive access to Transvaal gold reserves. Economic balance of power would shift permanently from London to Berlin. The issue was no longer about the voting rights of a few thousand British miners in Johannesburg. The issue was whether the City of London would retain its monopoly over the global financial system. In the quiet offices of the Treasury, mathematical consensus was reached. The gold of the Witwatersrand had to be nationalized by the British Empire. All the independent Boer republics had to be dissolved, as they were oppressive, as they were undemocratic, as their sovereign existence, however, threatened the liquidity of the British pound. The British taxpayer would be told the coming war was a noble crusade to protect British citizens abroad. But the men who drafted the ultimatums knew the true objective. They were going to war to secure the collateral for the world's largest debt machine. The stage was set, financial lines were drawn, cost of saving the pound was about to be built to the battlefields of South Africa. Understand how a war for liquidity is actually manufactured. We must step away from the politicians in Parliament and look at a far more tight-knit circle, private network of wealth, known as the Golden Syndicate. By 1895, financial pressure on London had created a dangerous alignment of interest. Between the British Colonial Office and a handful of multimillionaire mining magnates, in South Africa. At the absolute center of this network stood a man whose name became synonymous with imperial ruthlessness. Cecil Rhodes. Rhodes was not just a politician. I was the undisputed king of the De Beers diamond monopoly. But his true obsession, was not diamonds. It was the deep-level gold mines, of the Witwatersrand. Osram, along with his primary financial partner, Alfred Beat, controlled consolidated gold fields of one of the largest corporate conglomerates operating in the Transvaal Republic. But to extract gold from deep underground, hired massive amounts of capital, advanced machinery, and uninterrupted political compliance. President Paul Kruger's independent Boer government was standing directly in the way of maximum corporate profit. Years, Rhodes and Bate attempted to use their immense wealth, high political influence within the Boer administration. But Kruger was unyielding. Recognized that if the British mining monopolies consolidated total power, the sovereignty of the Boer republics would evaporate. So when bribery failed, the syndicate turned to a far more volatile strategy. They decided to weaponize the British immigrant miners, Uitlanders who had flooded into Johannesburg. Public narrative created by the London press was one of human rights, claiming that British citizens were being denied the right to vote by a backward tyrannical regime. The private letters of Cecil Rhodes tell a completely different story. Confidential message to his co-conspirators, Rhodes admitted that the voting issue was merely a political hammer, all designed to crack open the Boer state. from the inside. The real objective was the forced integration of the Transvaal into a British-controlled South African federation. A federation where the tax laws the railway rates, and the gold production would be dictated by the boardrooms of London. To finance this manufactured crisis, Odds and Bate established a secret fund. Hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling were funneled from corporate accounts of a private paramilitary operation. The plan was calculated with precision. A British military officer named Leander Starr Jameson had lead a private army of 500 armed men across the border into the Transvaal. Simultaneously, the British miners in Johannesburg, financed by the syndicate, would stage an armed insurrection. Jameson's forces would ride in as protectors. The Boer government would be overthrown in the chaos, and the British Empire would step in to restore order. Classic corporate hostile takeover executed with repeating rifles, idle and private capital. But on December 29th, 1895, Jameson Raid collapsed into absolute disaster. The miners in Johannesburg, realizing they were being used as pawns in a financial gamble, failed to rise up. President Kruger's commando forces, highly mobile and deeply familiar with the terrain, surrounded Jameson's private army within days. The entire force was captured, and Cecil Rhodes was forced to resign as Prime Minister of the Cape Colony in disgrace. The raid was an international scandal. Kaiser even sent a personal telegram to Kruger, congratulating him on repelling the invaders without foreign help. But if you look at the ledger books of the City of London, following the disaster, you realize that the failure of the raid only escalated the financial emergency. The banking cartels, including the high finance directors of the House of Rothschild, had already invested millions into deep-level mining infrastructure. Every day the Transvaal remained independent, as a day their capital was tied up under foreign jurisdiction. Kaiser's telegram proved that Germany was eyeing the Witwatersrand gold, backing for its own rising currency. For London, the timeline had just contracted. The private plot of Cecil Rhodes had failed, which meant the financial syndicate now needed a much larger machine to finish the job. They needed the full, unrestricted weight of the British Imperial Army. In London, Alfred Bate and other mining lords began working directly with Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain. Chamberlain was a fierce imperialist who believed that British industrial dominance required total control of global resource networks. Together, the politicians and the billionaires began an aggressive propaganda campaign. They used newspapers like the London Times, which were deeply influenced by banking interests, to whip the British public into a frenzy. Patois farmers were painted as brutal, primitive oppressors of British workers. But behind the media noise, the real negotiations were happening in the private dining clubs of the city. The merchant banks agreed to guarantee the financing for an unprecedented military buildup in South Africa. They were underwriting a war. Not for the honor of the Queen, not for the rights of the miners, but to secure the physical collateral that would save the global gold standard. By 1899, the British government had sent tens of thousands of troops to the borders of the Transvaal. They made demands that no sovereign nation could ever accept, effectively demanding that Kruger surrender his country's independence by a fixed deadline. The corporate syndicate had successfully leveraged the entire British Empire. War was no longer an option. It was a financial necessity. Ledger books had been balanced, credit lines were secured, private interests of the syndicate to become the official foreign policy of the world's greatest empire. When the British Imperial Army finally crossed the border into the Boer republics in October 1899, the public was told conflict would be swift, furious, and relatively cheap. The military planners in London, operating on old colonial assumptions, predicted that a budget of £10 million would be more than enough to crush the resistance. They believed a few weeks of professional infantry maneuvers would force President Kruger to sign a liquidation treaty. History is rarely dictated by the optimism of generals. As the Boer commando forces, all utilizing deep familiarity with the veldt, smokeless Mauser rifles, and brilliant guerrilla tactics, shattered the British columns during a single catastrophic week, known as Black Week. Suddenly, London realized that this was not a minor colonial policing operation. This was a total industrial war, and an industrial war consumes money at a terrifying, compounding rate. By early 1900, cost of maintaining nearly 500,000 British soldiers from on the other side of the planet fined up to more than £2.5 million from every single week. The initial £10 million war budget was incinerated, ours from within the first 2 months. For the British government, the battlefield crisis immediately transformed into a desperate domestic financial emergency. Government cannot wage a war on empty pockets. The traditional method of increasing income taxes on the British public had already reached its political limit. Raising taxes further, thus triggering widespread anti-war riots in the streets of London and Manchester. To keep the troop ships moving, to keep the ammunition factories producing, and to keep the global credit empire from freezing, the British state had to step through a different door. They had to borrow heavily from the private capital market. They had to auction off future tax revenues of the empire in the form of war bonds. And this is where the hidden network of the City of London, absolute control of the imperial war machine. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Michael Hicks Beach, was forced to negotiate directly with the elite merchant banking houses. Houses like N.M. Rothschild and Sons, and the London representatives of J.P. Morgan, these private banking institutions, did not view the conflict through the lens of patriotism. They viewed the British Empire as a corporate debtor, a massive client, currently overdrawing their account to secure a vital asset. The Rothschilds, who had already underwritten millions in private corporate loans for Cecil Rhodes's mining companies, understood that if Great Britain abandoned the war due to financial exhaustion, from the Witwatersrand gold mines would remain under foreign control, from the British loans would default, and the gold standard would fracture. And so the banking cartel agreed to underwrite the imperial debt. They organized massive, the short-term credit syndicates, issuing billions in government consols and war loan stocks. But this financial life support came with an invisible, unwritten leverage. Every time a private banker signed a multi-million-pound credit line, for the British Treasury, the boundaries between sovereign government policy, private corporate interest, completely evaporated. The British military was no longer just fighting for the honor of Queen Victoria. They were operating as an enforcement wing for the bondholders of the City of London. They were bankrolling a machine that had to deliver a specific return on investment. Total, unconditional annexation of the South African gold fields. As the debt fined, pressure on the military commanders in South Africa, and brutal. The financiers in London demanded a rapid resolution to stop the hemorrhaging of liquidity. But the Boer commandos refused to surrender, disappearing into the vast terrain after every ambush. The war was locked in a costly, bloody stalemate. And when a corporate hostile takeover was trapped in a stalemate, the methods of extraction progressively colder and more tan none. If the enemy could not be defeated on the open battlefield, the syndicate's machine to target the very foundations of civilian survival. The ledger books in London staying open late into the night. From the interest rates on the war debt, and every line of credit extended by the banks was a direct command to the generals: escalate the violence, regardless of the human cost. The war machine was fully funded. The money was flowing. The ammunition trains were packed. The next chapter of the Witwatersrand audit was about to be written. So scorched earth. By late 1900, the war for the Witwatersrand evolved into something completely unrecognizable to the British public. All the sweeping cavalry charges, on traditional infantry maneuvers, on. In their place, stood a long, exhausting, and financially ruinous guerrilla conflict. The Boer commando squads, refusing to surrender their land, had broken into small, highly mobile partisan cells, struck at British supply trains, telegraph wires, and dissolved back into the vast, empty veldt. For the bondholders in the City of London, every day this deadlock continued. It was a disaster. The compounding interest on the imperial war debt was draining the gold reserves of the Bank of England faster than anyone had predicted. Hostile corporate takeover was dragging on. Cost of capital was finding out of control. To protect the liquidity of the pound, the new British military commander, Kitchener, was given a cold, from bureaucratic mandate. If the enemy could not be defeated on the traditional battlefield, the war machine would have to liquidate our socio-economic infrastructure that kept them alive. Kitchener initiated a massive, systematic scorched-earth policy across the South African republics. British regiments swept through the Transvaal and the Orange Free State with explicit instructions to destroy everything. They burned down over 30,000 Boer homesteads, systematically slaughtered millions of cattle, poisoned thousands of freshwater wells. Vast, fertile landscape was turned into an absolute barren desert. But the most terrifying element of this economic liquidation, how the machine system managed the displaced civilian population. To prevent the women, children, and elderly dependents of the Boer fighters providing food or intelligence to the commandos. The British military constructed a vast network of heavily guarded enclosures. History would record these installations as the world's first modern concentration camps. From over 120,000 Boer civilians, along with tens of thousands of black African laborers, were rounded up, packed into cattle cars, pumped into these barbed wire cities. Camps were not built for industrial mass murder, in the way the world would see decades later. But they were designed with a complete hierarchical indifference to human survival. The British military administration, operating under intense pressure from London to cut expenses, treated civilian survival as a low priority line item on the imperial ledger. Food rations were calculated down to the barest minimum for survival. The families of men who were still actively fighting in the commandos were given a specialized starvation diet. Receiving no meat and no fresh vegetables calculated psychological leverage to force their husbands to surrender. Conditions inside the canvas tents rapidly disintegrated into a living nightmare. Water sources became contaminated with typhoid, basic medical supplies were withheld, and overcrowding turned the camps into incubation chambers, dying for deadly disease. Epidemics of measles, dysentery, and pneumonia swept through the rows of tents, with terrifying speed. Wasn't it? The children whose immune systems were already hollowed out by starvation died by the thousands. Every morning, under the pale African sun, carts moved through the barbed wire, collecting the small, linen-wrapped bodies. Lots of letters written by humanitarian observers like Emily Hobhouse, which leaked back to London, described scenes of skeletal children dying in the dirt. But in the high offices of the colonial treasury, these reports were greeted with a chilling apathy. As on the balance sheet of the Golden Syndicate, these thousands of civilian deaths were merely viewed as an unavoidable friction, necessary structural cost to force the capitulation of a stubborn nation. The oddity of the global financial system hired the total annexation of the Witwatersrand gold fields. And if 30,000 women and children had to be sacrificed to protect the credit of the pound sterling, the banking syndicates were more than willing to underwrite that cost. The lives of those families had been commodified, earned into an exchange rate of the survival of the imperial financial monopoly. By late 1901, called arithmetic of Kitchener's strategy began to crush the spirit of the resistance. Off the Boer commandos, Hansen, receiving frantic messages about the extinction of their families in the camps, realized they were no longer fighting for victory. They were fighting against the total annihilation of their people. The ledger books in London had successfully leveraged the ultimate human collateral. The genocide was fully funded. Asset was almost secured. And the true price of the global gold standard. Asset was being paid in full, by the unmarked graves from the South African desert. On May 31st, 1902, a signing of the Treaty of Vereeniging officially brought an end to the hostilities in South Africa. Newspapers in London exploded with celebratory headlines, claiming a glorious victory for the British Empire. The public watched parades of returning soldiers, believing that the peace treaty was a testament to imperial honor and justice. But when you turn the pages of the official peace settlement, and look at the financial restructuring that followed, the illusions of military glory instantly evaporate. The Treaty of Vereeniging was not a document of reconciliation, as it was a liquidation agreement. Under the terms of the treaty, the independent Boer republics were officially dissolved. Their territories, including the priceless Witwatersrand gold fields, were completely annexed into the British Crown. But there was a peculiar, highly revealing clause in the settlement. The British government agreed offering to pay £3 million to the defeated Boer farmers compensation for the destruction of their property. To the casual observer, this appeared to be an act of imperial generosity, a noble gesture from a victorious superpower, help a broken enemy rebuild. But if you track the flow of that money through the banking houses of the City of London, the true nature of the transaction becomes chillingly clear. The £3 million did not come from a fund of compassion. It was a restructuring loan payment designed to quickly pacify the region and get the mining infrastructure back online. The banking cartels had underwritten hundreds of millions in imperial war debt, were losing fortunes every week. Mines sat dormant. They didn't care about the burnt homesteads, thousands of children buried in the desert dust. They cared about the balance sheet. Gold production of Johannesburg had to resume at maximum capacity, stem the catastrophic drain of bullion from the Bank of England's vaults. Within months of the peace signing, caused the forced integration of South Africa into the global financial machine complete. The raw gold from the deep level shafts of the Witwatersrand began pouring back into London in unprecedented volumes. Every week, heavily armored cargo ships arrived at the docks of Liverpool, carrying tons of South African bullion. A massive, uninterrupted influx of physical gold, as it did exactly what the Golden Syndicate calculated years before. It stabilized the British pound sterling. It restored the reserve ratio of the Bank of England, reinforced the global gold standard, and secured London's monopoly over international credit. The British financial empire was saved from the brink of bankruptcy. Who actually owned the prize, had been bought with so much blood. When the dust settled, the ownership of the mines did not belong to the British public, and it certainly did not belong to people who lived on the land. Mining rights and corporate shares were rapidly consolidated by a cartel of mega conglomerates. Monopolies like Consolidated Gold Fields and the newly emerging Anglo-American Corporation dominated the economy. The elite directors of the syndicate, including the corporate heirs of Cecil Rhodes, and the merchant banking families of London, watched their private fortunes fin up to astronomical heights. The war had been funded by the British taxpayer. Price had been paid by the lives of tens of thousands of civilians in the concentration camps. But the dividends of the slaughter were funneled exclusively into private ledger books in the City of London. Furthermore, the post-war order established a deeply ruthless economic system on sheer cheap labor for the mines. Maximize profit margins, pay off the lingering war debts, As from the new British administration imposed heavy taxes, passed laws on the black African population. This legal framework forced millions of native Africans off their ancestral lands, off from and directly into the dangerous, low-wage subterranean shafts of the British gold corporations. The infrastructure of exploitation was built to balance the post-war ledger. Laid the structural foundations for what would eventually become the system of apartheid. History books record the Boer War as a separate, isolated chapter of colonial conflict, an unfortunate event that ended with a standard peace treaty, from in 1902. But the financial records show from that the war never truly ended. It simply transitioned from a military campaign into a permanent corporate occupation. Battlefield was locked, territory was financialized, and the invisible ledger of the Golden Syndicate continued to extract its returns, decade after decade, from the deep rock of South Africa. When we look back at the landscape of 1902, the history books tell us that a nation's sovereignty was decided by treaties signed under imperial flags. They give us the names of prime ministers, generals, and diplomats, leaving the impression that geopolitical power is a product of political willpower alone. But the dust of the South African veld tells a far colder story. The Boer War was not an isolated colonial error. It was a terrifying demonstration how far a global financial center will go to secure the physical collateral that underwrites its existence. The war machine incinerated 30,000 homes and claimed the lives of 27,000 women and children. That was not fueled by national pride. It was bankrolled, line by line, by short-term loans, bonds, and private banking credit. Physical gold of the Witwatersrand was extracted from the deep, dark earth, only to be locked away up inside the dark subterranean vaults of the Bank of England. Pound sterling was saved. Double gold standard was preserved. And the City of London maintained its financial monopoly over the coming century. The ledger books were balanced. But a balanced ledger does not mean the debt is erased. It simply means the invoice transferred to a population that had no voice in the room. History often records the names of those who signed the peace agreements. The true cost of global liquidity is always written in the soil of those who paid the price.